I've attended a number of these over the years at Metro, so it's kind of exciting to be giving one myself, from home, but still pretty excited. So today I'm going to talk about some of the reasons that I wrote Kings of Broken Things, along with a reading of a few excerpts from the novel. But first, I just wanted to make sure we're mostly on the same page and wanted to do a little crash course of the history of the race riot of Omaha Race Riot of 1919. So the novel itself takes place from April 1917, which was the month that the U.S. declared war on Germany, and then it ends in September 1919, which was when the Omaha Race Riot occurred. Okay, hopefully y'all can see this, but so I have a little PowerPoint here to kind of run through. There's the cover of the book. I do want to acknowledge that, so I have a lot of historical or period photographs that I used while researching and writing the book. So to give credit where it's due to the Durham Museum, the Omaha Public Library, and the Omaha World Herald. All right, so our kind of crash course here. So September 28th, 1919 was the date that the Omaha Race Riot occurred. So we're just a few weeks out from the 101st anniversary of this. There were between 5,000 to 15,000 people who took part in the riot. The vast majority of these were just kind of bystanders, onlookers, people like that, which is pretty critical to what I'm going to be talking about today. Just thinking about the notion of bystanders during events like this. As many of you probably know, Mayor Edward Parsons Smith was attacked by the mob when he had gone out of the courthouse to try to talk sense into people. He was hanged, but ended up surviving. He was never really the same after that. I don't know that he really functioned as the mayor. I think he was hospitalized for a handful of months after this, but he did survive. Will Brown, of course, was lynched. So he was kind of the focus of this. He was a 40-year-old African-American man living in Omaha, kind of an itinerant worker who was accused of raping a 19-year-old white woman. At the time, Omaha was one of 25 cities where riots like this occurred. It was known as the Red Summer of 1919. James Weldon Johnson kind of coined that term. But this was a huge national phenomenon, which Omaha kind of came in towards the end of. But what happened in Omaha was and is regarded as one of the most brutal and largest tragedies that took place that summer. The kind of thing that I know it made newspapers in Europe. I was on the front page of the New York Times, so it was a big event. Just looking at the causes here. So while all this was occurring, we had second wave Great Migration, where 15 years before this, I think there were under 4,000 African Americans who lived in Omaha. By 1920, there would be over 20,000. Probably familiar with a lot of this history, especially in places like Chicago and Detroit, where it's just a sea change of Black people moving from the South to the North. Of course, the Red Summer, as I mentioned, which potentially had thousands of race-motivated killings and lynchings, which is why he called it the Bloody Red Summer. There were also labor wars. A Red Scare was going on, and it was the end of World War II, which ended in November of 1918. But just to dwell on World War I. The new book I'm writing now is set in World War II, so I feel like I'm going to accidentally say that a lot. Anyway, to dwell on World War I just a moment here, just how big of a thing that was. 37 million people died during this 4-year period. That's both civilian and military deaths. 3 European empires collapsed. And of course, there was the Spanish flu epidemic, which started in 1918. It infected an estimated 500 million people worldwide, which was about 1/3 of the population on the entire planet, and killed at least 20 million people. In addition, the Spanish flu killed, or excuse me, not Spanish flu, but overall, 116,000 US military personnel died, both from the conflict and the flu. So, just massive upheaval at this time, worldwide panic, desperation. There were widespread food shortages too, which I'll kind of get to, but a lot of stuff going on. So more locally at this time, in addition to this red summer, how it was kind of playing out, there was a lot of or hysteria about black criminality, which was fueled by the newspapers, specifically the Omaha Bee. There was a big crime wave that summer. In particular, there were 30 instances of rape of white women in Omaha alone that summer. And as I mentioned, the food shortages. So even locally, there was a lot of hysteria, a lot of drama being played out that really fed into the riot coming about. I should also mention too, of course, Tom Dennison, infamous machine boss of Omaha. So his coalition, which included then mayor, or who was the mayor after the riot and before it, Cowboy Jim Dahlman, they had lost the election in 1918. And this was the only election that Tom Dennison's coalition lost during his 30 years that he was in power in Omaha. So more or less his machine, Dennison himself, they embarked on this campaign to delegitimize the new reform administration, and the moral squad was the new mayor, the new police chief, kind of swept into office on these promises that they were going to clean up Omaha. But really, what you'd see Dennison do is inflaming passions for political gain throughout all of this. So I'd mentioned like the 30 rapes that had occurred. I was believe that most, if not all of these, were committed by white men in blackface who were working for the Dennison machine. So, kind of playing up on this racial tension and the race wars that were going on, they would go out and commit these crimes in blackface just to get people worked up for their own, for their own political game, where they could go out and say, the new guy, can't keep you safe. But back when Dahlman were in power, you were safe. So that was kind of their pitch. And then lastly, just kind of thinking about the Examined Carnival was that weekend. I'm sure a lot of you are kind of familiar with what that was or had seen pictures. The closest corollary I always kind of say is just how much downtown has changed when the College World Series comes. That's kind of what the Examined Carnival did, where tens of thousands of people are coming into town who don't live here, who are just kind of here to party and celebrate for a week. But also, just thinking about lynchings where they themselves kind of took the form of a carnival at that time. People would bring their kids, they'd bring picnics along, they'd put out blankets and they'd celebrate. Lynchings kind of took on that atmosphere of a carnival themselves. So the fact that this coincided with the Examined Carnival that weekend was a huge factor, just because you had so many people there looking to celebrate. All right, so here's a picture of Will Brown, and I'm going to read for a little bit, just kind of talking about how I got into writing the book and a little bit more about the history. But as we mentioned, Kings of Broken Things is set in World War I. It mostly follows the immigrant communities of the River Ward in Omaha that were the seat of power for Tom Dennison during those decades. So the book is mostly about playing baseball and fitting in somewhere new and growing apart from siblings. But a long section of Kings also describes the race riot and subsequent lynching of Will Brown. It's really troubling material, to say the least. And especially after this summer too, just looking at how the country has changed or failed to change in recent years, I think really makes this history more relevant, more troubling. So we've been focusing solely on Omaha, where major riots haven't occurred in decades, which I think still holds, although this summer was definitely one of the more contentious years we've seen in a very long time. But violence and segregation remain endemic among many of our populations. As a couple of examples, 3 times in the last decade, Nebraska had the highest homicide victimization rate for African Americans in the entire nation. And that rate is generally twice the national average. So these kind of things kind of play into Omaha being named, I think on 3 occasions last decade by the Violence Policy Center as, quote, the most dangerous place in America to be Black. So these are difficult things to talk about, but things we do need to acknowledge and to speak to. I think especially as it relates to this history that I set up earlier, many people in Omaha would rather just kind of forget the bad times, the bad times in the past, even, not much less even the bad times now. During the first few weeks when this book came out in 2017, a few people online questioned why we should, quote, stir up trouble by revisiting the riot. And some expressed opinions similar to a Facebook user who commented on the Omaha World Herald story about the book and the riot by saying that history like this is hidden for a reason. They said history like this is hidden for a reason. And I do think that's an important question to ask ourselves. You know, anytime we're talking about history, anytime we are bringing stuff up, you know, especially, maybe especially in a fictional sense, like my novel does. You know, do we agree that history should be hidden? Or do we think that acknowledging our history is an important part of reconciling with racial violence in Omaha? And generally, I side with the famous William Faulkner line from his novel Requiem for a Nun, which is, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." But personally, I think, you know, it does get a little murky. It is a little murky, even to me, why I work so stubbornly to finish and publish this particular novel. I'm not a native to Omaha, and I have no family connection to what happened here 100 years ago. I could have largely shrugged off the troubles detailed in Kings of Broken Things if I wanted to, as many do. I think it's generally easy enough for white Midwest Americans like me to walk away from what can be seen as other people's problems. And to a certain degree, I think I did turn away. I saw myself as a bystander that never meant harm to anyone and was therefore pardonable. So why did I write this book, and why do I think it's important? Many of the events happened in places I walked by every day for the near decade it took me to finish Kings of Broken Things. I work as a reporter, most of this time going to the Douglas County Courthouse where the riot occurred on a daily basis to read the new briefs filed. So these were spots that I walked by every single day. And once I knew that a man had been lynched and hung from a light pole on a particular corner on my path to work, it was impossible to not wonder about that each time I was on the spot. Not only what happened there, you know, what it would have sounded like, what it would have felt like to be overwhelmed in that crush of fanatical anger, but also the eerie experience of standing in that space 100 years later and hearing the echoes. Some of you might have had a similar experience when being around the courthouse in that area of downtown. Knowing the history of a place can haunt you, much as that very place can be haunted. My first writing professor, the novelist Janice Agee, who does some amazing historical novels set in and around Nebraska, she often talked about what she calls the psychosis of the land. That is how trauma was experienced in most places on the prairie, and even if you no longer see the direct effect of that trauma, it has left a mark. So I wondered what it meant that a man was lynched on the spot where there's now a crosswalk that I used to get to work, that the light post he was hung from had been replaced several times since then, but that there's still a light post there. I think especially as time passed, writing this book, as the destruction of Black bodies again became a generational dilemma for our society, as we learn names like Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, George Floyd, and so many others, how could you not wonder about what kind of nation we are, what kind of city, and what kind of people we are that this keeps happening? One of the interesting parts about doing events in the 3 years since the book has been out has been meeting people in Omaha who have a family connection to the race riot. You know, in whatever different way, you know, just people have lived, their families have been here a long time. Especially when the book was first out, at almost every event, someone would come up to tell an anecdote about their great uncle who was a policeman who tried to stop the riot, or even a few people who were related to the key figures who led the riot. You know, it was always an interesting thing where I feel like people had these family artifacts, like these news articles or diary entries, and, you know, probably been holding on to them for, you know, decades, for 60 years, or maybe, you know, somebody holding on to them for close to 100 years. So it kind of gave them the occasion to come share these with someone who was interested in it. But it was something I thought about a lot, even while writing the book, too. This idea that the event, you know, the riot is still present in our lives, even 100 years later. And that in my fictional world, many of the descendants of characters would still be living in Omaha. So this was a main influence on the perspective I chose to tell the story, which is mostly through the eyes of a group of German and Austrian American boys and young men who live in an immigrant neighborhood near the courthouse. So I'd like to read a little bit from that section for a few minutes here, just to kind of give you a sense of the book, but also just like who the main characters are. This Carol Mierstein, who we end up following through a lot of the book. So this is from the very start. Consider Carl Mierstein. In 1917, he was 11 years old, new to Omaha, fresh off the boat when he met the boys in the schoolyard. He was from Salzburg, he said, but had come from Galitzine, over there, where the Eastern Front of the war was being fought. His father repaired musical instruments. His mother had been a famous actress and singer out in the far reaches of the empire his family fled from. But his mother was dead by then. She died back there, and maybe this was why his family had to run from Europe in such a hurry like they did. And of course, there was the war. Carl was an interesting kid. He had talents. His English came off as well as his German. He could run. He was bigger than most boys his age and knew a little violin when pressed to play. But these were inessential skills. That spring, Carl got to know the boys on Clandish, so he learned how important it was here to be good at baseball. Once the weather turned warm, the boys divvied into teams. They were the oldest in their school, 11, 12, 13, at the end of boyhood. Carl wasn't the last one picked that year, even though he didn't have a clue how to play. There were two others who were known to be horrible at baseball, for reasons that couldn't be helped. One whose rickety legs were being straightened by iron braces, and another whose hair was kept shorn to eradicate the bugs that plagued him. So Carl grinned when the captains from one team grabbed his arm and pulled him to their side before it came down to the final pick. Alfred Brown and Jimmy Mack, boys from his class, were the two who picked him. It wasn't until then that they asked if he even played. I never held a baseball before, Carl admitted. Are you kidding? Can you throw? It was no use lying. Once they fetched the ball and Carl sort of flipped its sidearm to Alfred, sort of rolled the ball in the schoolyard gravel, they saw all they needed to see. You live with Mrs. Maria, yeah? Alfred asked. Sure he does, Jimmy said. I seen him before. You got all sisters, don't you? Carl didn't like to talk about his sisters. The elder pair teased him a lot and were too old to care about anyway. But Carl's other sister, Anna, was only a year older than him, and he protected her. Don't you think they're pretty, your sisters? Alfred sucked on the pit of a cherry. He kept fruit in his pockets, stolen from the market, like lots of kids did. If Carl was going to make friends with any of the boys, he could do worse than Alfred Brown and Jimmy McHenry. Sure, Jimmy was measly-faced, Irish, and Carl had been warned against trusting the Irish. Then there was Alfred, who had wide hips and a big rump that ballooned his trousers and back. He never wore a belt because he didn't need one. Alfred didn't have baby fat on his cheeks either, a strange thing for a stout boy, like all his mass should erode to his feet. Neither Jimmy nor Alfred came from model families. This made Carl feel better about the boys, like he was one of them. They had questions for Carl now that he was on their team, what work his father did, and why his sister Anna was pulled from school. How Carl lived in New York City for a year after he came over, saw the Statue of Liberty and went to the Polo Grounds once, but only because he and his father took the wrong 9th Avenue L transfer and ended up in Harlem by mistake, and not necessarily to see Christy Mathewson in the Giants play. Even though he didn't know who the ace hurler Christy Mathewson was, the boys respected Carl once he told how he'd escaped from the war in Europe. He and his father and his sisters had run halfway across the continent to board an American ocean liner in Bremerhaven. There was fighting where he lived before that. Is that why you haven't got a mom? Jimmy asked. Did she die in the war? Yeah, Carl admitted. She was killed. He felt himself toughen saying that, staring past those boys into the street. He hadn't been able to say it before. It was his mother who Carl took after. She'd had a round face and big cheeks and strong shoulders like Carl did. He didn't really remember her. His sisters told him these things. But that's how he knew anything, secondhand. He had to accept what his sisters said, how his mother was beautiful and cruel sometimes if she felt like it, and how she was killed in Austria-Hungary and northernmost Galitzine among the Carpathian Mountains, by Tsarist Russian soldiers, by a Serb assassin, by a stray bullet. Carl knew nothing about that. His sisters wouldn't tell. He didn't want to know how it happened anyway, not as a boy. She was his mother. She'd smiled at him, tucked him into bed, then lifted him from his blankets in the morning and fed him sugary bits torn from a marzipan pastry. He remembered that, didn't he? That was all he had of her. So I'll kind of stop there, but just to give you an idea about who the perspective of the book is. These kind of immigrant boys in living on the River Ward, downtown Omaha. So there's an old truism among writers that the process of writing a novel is what teaches you how to write that novel. And maybe only that novel alone too, which is kind of the frustrating thing. I'd add that the process of writing a novel can also show, not only how, but also why you are writing a particular novel. The toughest question I struggled with was why I should be the person to write this book. There was a little voice inside my head that told me to be quiet. In truth, although it's much too late to turn back now, of course, I'm still not so sure that I was the right person. My instinct is to hold tightly to the good things I have in life, like many people, and just forget the rest. However, as I was writing this novel, I struggled with appropriation issues and finding the best perspective to tell the story. But there was another little voice that told me I couldn't use my position or my race as a way to get out of writing about these issues, or for that matter, contemplating how ethnicity and whiteness have been elemental forces in the development of Omaha. I had to try my best to write and publish this novel, so I didn't feel like I'd copped out when given an opportunity to do good work. For me, King's was always about reaching, to understand ideas bigger than me, to compose a novel beyond my abilities, to write a story that's more than the sum of my fears, misconceptions, and prejudices. These things that comprise the worst phase for all of us. There are a lot of reasons to write. The most tangible for me has always been the process of creating something from myself that's better than myself. So armed with this high-mindedness from the beginning, I wanted to use certain immigrant narratives and the shaky status of German Americans during World War I to set up what I knew was coming at the end of the novel. The literal placeness of whiteness in the riot was a key part of the strategy, insofar as the riot had to involve diverse notions of whiteness. So not only belligerent working class louts who stormed the courthouse, but also reviled hyphenated German Americans eager to improve their station, political movers and shakers who wield prejudice to get what they want, and just as important, a bunch of pleasant folks who are there to be nice to their neighbors, who desire little except to remain pleasant. Those Nebraskans who want to live on the fringes, just out of the reach of the troubles of other folks. So bystanders like me. Yet in the early drafts, no main characters were actively involved in the riot. I worried a lot about making my characters likable, at least those who were precious to me. But the novel was really flat written this way, particularly because I didn't want to implicate any of my good characters in such an evil act by having them inside the courthouse, much as I wouldn't want to implicate myself. The novel only really began to make sense after I transformed teenage baseball prodigy Carl Mierstein, who I introduced to you earlier. He gets much, much better at baseball. So he becomes an active participant in the riot. And I let him find his way to the spot where Will Brown is seized by the lynch mob. By making Carl a courthouse raider, this was no longer a disembodied whiteness that merely observed evil acts. Carl was there. He touched Will Brown. It took me a long time to willingly go to this place with one of my precious characters. Of course, from the beginning, none of them were ever really clean, so there was no purity to protect. All of this eventually leads up to the riot and lynching of Will Brown. And I'm going to read from that part of the book here in a moment. But first, I just want to say, what we do kind of know about Will Brown, because there isn't a ton that we, can confirm. He was about 40 years old or so, as I mentioned earlier. He worked as a laborer, as a coal runner in stockyards and lumber yards. He had rheumatoid arthritis at the end of his life and was described as a hunchback in the papers. And he was unable to close his hands. He was so disabled at that point. Of course, there are a lot of conspiracies that he was set up and didn't actually commit the rape, which seems likely, but most of that evidence, that he was very crippled at that point in his life and couldn't physically have fought off this young woman and her young man boyfriend. And it seems like the evidence supports that. There were rumors that Will Brown and Agnes Lobeck, this was the woman who accused him of rape, that they knew each other in the underworld. That she was a prostitute and he had crossed her somehow. And this is why he was picked out and that he was accused of doing this to her. So that's only a rumor, one that's repeated a lot, but still a rumor. It is a fact that he lived with another black man and a white woman in a house near 5th and Cedar. It was called, quote, the trouble house on our block by the woman who first identified Will Brown to police. So his being lynched sent a message to anyone and everyone who crossed those lines. I think that's important to remember, probably more than anything else. I'm going to read here from the intro of Will Brown in the book, where it kind of comes towards the end. Everyone had a theory about who he was. No one knew for sure. He's someone the boys wondered about a lot in the years after 1919. After what they did that September. Will Brown. What was he thinking when the cops handed him over? Could he hear what that mob promised to do to him? Consider that Will Brown lived in Gibson. It wasn't easy for a black man there, not far from Rourke Park and right next to Riverview Park. He was 40 years old, pockmarked with a small mustache. He came from Cairo, Illinois. Some said Will Brown got a girl pregnant and a judge in Cairo was going to order them married. That was how he ended up in Omaha, running out on that girl. Men like him moved around so much, it was hard to say what made them go from one place to the next. Most of them in Omaha worked in stockyards, a lot of them scabs who took the jobs of doughboys. A black man was guaranteed nearly $2 a day in the yards. With some money to spend, a place to live, life would have been good enough for Will Brown. But he was getting old that summer. He felt bad in his back, his legs and arms. His neck would have always been twisted. Some days it wasn't all that bad if he didn't get work, if he could rest on a park bench and look at a newspaper. Otherwise, it meant staying home. He and another black man lived under the same roof with a white woman that year. Their place on Cedar Street wouldn't have been much, and some backwater ward bisected by freight lines. A shack so close to the Missouri that Will Brown could sit on a tar paper roof with a bottle and watch the river swell in the late hours if he wanted to. He could have seen riverboats float downstream at night, electric lights shimmering on the water, heard cornet calls echoing off the cottonwoods on the Iowa side. There wasn't much legitimate fun a black man could have down in South Omaha, besides going to a lunchroom for beans and coffee. Sitting on a roof and listening to a jazz band play a riverboat was a jubilation most nights. If he felt sick and sore, it would be. People on those boats wore white suits and dresses and bathed in electric light. They drank illegal booze and danced to hot music. Everybody else had to sit down in the muck to listen. If they lived down in the muck, they'd hear by and by, like Will Brown would have. So while working on this book, I found myself more and more interested in the group of boys who surround Carl Mierstein and his working class neighborhood, those who come together mostly because of their shared love of baseball, but also because it was a group of 300 teenage boys who actually started the riot when they marched on the courthouse. Because of this, King spends a lot of time reveling in the hijinks of young white men, petty theft, brawling, sneaking into bars, barging into neighborhoods where Black people live, and returning to tell the tale. Traditional good old boy lore. Of course, I too went through a similar initiation as a young man, the vastly more restrained 1990s Lincoln version, but still. What I remember most are the times, we should have got in trouble, my friends and I, for whatever we were up to, but we were almost always let off the hook. Around when the final draft of this book was nearly complete, this was in February 2015, I was talking with a friend from those salad days in Lincoln, and the question was raised about whether or not we'd have been at the riot if we were teenagers in Omaha in 1919. At first, we both said, no, of course not. But given a moment, we admitted that we would have been there. Not as raiders who snatched Will Brown, but amidst the teens who took advantage of the chaos to smash out a window in a government building and slur police without consequences. At least compared to our life in Lincoln in the 1990s, of course, we would have been there. We'd have had nothing to lose in going. Not in a physical sense, not in terms of our freedom. We would have been let off the hook for whatever we did in this unequal system we inherited, but nonetheless maintain, just like the men and boys who murdered Will Brown were let off the hook. It makes me sick sometimes to think about all the things my friends and I got away with when we were growing up, not because our misadventures were so terrible, but because not every young man in this country gets to walk away from petty crime. I'd never thought to use Kings of Broken Things as a way to vindicate or condemn anyone for what happened. I think the lynching of Will Brown was an obviously irredeemable act. But even for those who weren't perpetrators, even for the bystanders, there is a degree of complicity from walking away, from looking away. In my author's note, I mentioned that I consider this novel an act of remembering, which is to say it's a call for ownership of our history. And in a similar, maybe more important way, it's also an act of seeing where we live and who we live with. So I'm gonna wrap up by reading from the epilogue of the book, which is the boys in this neighborhood kind of thinking back when they're older about what happened around the lynching of Will Brown in the riot. But I'll be happy to answer any questions you guys have. If you want to type them in the Q&A or comments now, we'll get to them soon. The boys on Clandish wondered about these years as they grew older, the war years, the riot year, and how their city wasn't so splendid as they thought it was when they were young. The boys took jobs when they were old enough to get them, some in Jobbers Canyon warehouses, some in South Omaha stockyards. A few finished high school. Even fewer went to college, became lawyers and insurance executives and city administrators. Some moved far away. Most of the boys on Clandish stayed close. They had kids of their own who went to battle in Europe and what seemed like only a short time later. Sons who died on the beaches of Normandy. Those boys thought of what happened to Will Brown. Will Brown, who was buried in a potter's field at Forest Lawn Cemetery. They knew so little about him. There wasn't much of an effort to know more. Men like Will Brown just sort of disappeared those days. It was easy. A poor man might carry a state certificate in his billfold to prove he did in fact exist. He might have only one photograph of himself alone in that billfold. A man like Will Brown. Who was he supposed to give a photo to? Even for a man like Will Brown, who was lynched, whose name was in all 3 local dailies and the New York Times, the situation was only marginally different. They had his photo in the newspapers. A reporter must have found it in a drawer in his place after the cops dragged him out. Will Brown in his overalls and a denim shirt and what passed for his good hat. One that had a solid brim at least. A man with no family around, with no friends who could stand up to defend the man as a man. Nobody to eulogize him. No funeral, no words at his burial, unless the gravedigger said something. Unless the gravedigger spat on his grave, which was more likely. Nobody thought speaking on Will Brown's behalf was worthwhile, the boys guessed. They didn't know. Sure, the boys thought a lot about Will Brown, but they didn't know him. To them, he was unknowable. As the boys moved around once they were older, they'd see other towns that had lynchings, towns that had a certain prominent tree on the square, a hanging tree. A point of pride in these towns, maybe, a sign that read, 33 men hanged here. A stranger traveling through might think about what it did to a person to walk by that tree every day, to have a tree like that in your hometown, white or black or red or whatever. Just walking by that tree and knowing what was done there and what the purpose of that tree was, at least according to the people who ran that town. A tree that would outlive everybody. Will Brown came from Cairo, Illinois, an island of a city at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi. This was in the papers, how he'd lived there a long while. He'd probably been there when Froggy James was lynched in Cairo a decade earlier. He'd have been there when they chased Froggy to a residential neighborhood and pulled him from the shed he was hiding in and burned him alive in an alley. Maybe Will Brown walked those streets to get to work. Maybe he went by that very alley sometimes, where there were fire stains on the pavement and the eaves of houses, like there were bullet holes that marked the stone facade of the courthouse in Omaha. All right, well, that's all I have for my presentation. So I'll try to get to some questions here. I see there's 2 in the Q&A. So if you guys have any questions about the book or about the history that I kind of rushed over in the crash course, please feel free to jump in with those. Okay, so the first question, there was a brief cutoff when talking about Omaha being the most dangerous for Blacks, for suicides, for deaths. So this was for homicide victimization rates, where Omaha was 3 times in the 2010s the most deadly city by murder for Black people to live in. And it was also named 3 times as the most dangerous city to be Black in America. Thanks for that, Linda. Linda also asked, if you were to rewrite this book, what might you change? Add anything about the horrific nature of people going to a lynching as a day at the circus? So thanks, Linda, for that. This is something I've been asked a number of times and have thought quite a bit about, just like what would I do differently? I think the main thing is that I didn't really write a ton from, I just didn't really write any from the perspective of Will Brown and not a lot from the African-American community in Omaha at the time. The reason that I didn't was that most of my African-American writer friends that I had showed the book to kind of suggested to not go that route, where I think, especially now with things like the Pass the Mic movement, where if it's not really close to your experience, then you probably shouldn't speak to it. But in some ways, you know, I feel like it's not that I made a bad decision to do that necessarily, but it was maybe a part of the book that could have been expanded more. And if any of you had seen Red Summer, a play that at Blue Barn last fall, or at the end of last summer, I think that play, you know, really kind of added that gap that I wasn't either able to write or just didn't try hard enough to write for the novel. I was talking about, you know, that from the perspective, or these events from the perspective of the Black community, and showing Will Brown as a man more. Like this last part I read, I like a lot, and I think it, you know, exemplifies a lot about the perspective of the people telling the story, these immigrant white boys in Omaha. But, you know, it's very limited in a way too, where it just kind of sees Will Brown as a completely wretched person, you know, and he doesn't see about the joy in his life in a way that Red Summer, the play, you know, really exemplified and did a great job of showing. For the other thing too, which doesn't really have to do with like racial justice at all, but it just doesn't have a lot about the Spanish flu in the book. There is a chapter that deals with it. But just what we're going through now with the COVID pandemic, like in the book, it's just kind of like, oh, there was this pandemic and then it was over, you know, and that's that, which in some ways is how it played out. But it's also just like, you know, that many people dying, your life being upended that much. We couldn't really appreciate like what a big deal that was. But it is kind of funny to think back about the book and read it now and just think about a pandemic going on and like, you know, it's just kind of this side thing that's happening, where I think if I rewrote the book, you know, I'd have a lot more to think about along those lines. All right, so from Kathy, did you attend some of the events around the 100th anniversary? Do you feel they helped to educate Omahans on the history of this time period or not? Yeah, so I went to a bunch of them. There was a group called, which still is working, the Omaha Coalition for Racial Justice and Reconciliation, that did a lot of great work, monthly meetings that I'd went to. And I was, of course, at the courthouse on the morning of the centenary, where, you know, a lot of dignitaries were speaking. There was a soil collection ceremony with the Equal Justice Initiative to send some soil from the courthouse to Montgomery, Alabama, where there is a big memorial to lynching victims. I think as far as education, I think it did help. There's just a lot of stuff to talk about. And I think it gets tricky, as you can probably tell in my presentation too, where, you know, you could talk about the history of this for hours and it's all fascinating, it's all relevant. And I think people need to know it, but, you know, what's the point of it, you know? And maybe that's more to your question too, like, you know, you can educate people, but for what purpose? What are they getting out of it? And what are they gonna do with that? You know, it's not necessarily something that you can control, you know, too. You just kind of present your material and hopefully people can internalize it in a helpful way. Personally, I do feel like it was helpful, you know, like I'm sure we probably could have done more. I think I did around 30 events in 60 days talking about this history. So, you know, I was just exhausted by the time October came around. But it seemed like good work to do. I mean, that was a big part of why I wrote the book too, is that when I moved to Omaha in 2005, and then shortly after learned that this had happened, not a lot of people in Omaha really knew about it, like that there even was a lynching in Omaha, you know, that it happened at the courthouse. The place is, you know, still standing there on that spot. So I think that motivated me a lot to keep working on the book, that it was important to talk about, that any kind of attention that we could bring to it would hopefully, you know, be a positive force in the community in the long term. So hopefully it helps. I don't know. It's obviously, I mean, they're just massive issues to deal with when you talk about problems now and how do we make that better. But I feel like people knowing the history helps a lot, like just to see that, you know, all of this historical weight people carrying, you know, like this is what it is, like this is what it means. And specifically just thinking like about North Omaha and the Black community in Omaha, like after this happened in 1919, I think about half of the Black people in Omaha left Omaha. You know, they just got out of town because it was a bad place to be. And in a lot of ways, I feel like that kind of sentiment has never really waned either. When I was researching the book, I was on a message board that was kind of talking about it, and they were sharing a video, but it was a message board for African Americans to, like, if they were moving to a city or considering moving to a city, it's like, here's what you need to know about it. And like, I feel like maybe Black people knew about this more than white people did, you know, or at least in my circles, you know. So it's like this happened there, you know, like this was a big thing. And, you know, those things just don't really go away unless you address them. All right, so PB Gates, next question. Interesting to hear how race relations have changed in 100 years, yet systemic racism still exists in Omaha and elsewhere. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the big questions that I always try to bring up and get people to think about, like maybe like have things changed that much, and in what ways? So I think, you know, like, I don't know, I think things have definitely improved in some ways since, you know, this time. You know, this kind of spectacle of lynching is not acceptable and hasn't been acceptable in our society in a long time. So, you know, that's progress, you know, it doesn't mean Black bodies are safe from, you know, being murdered, from being mutilated, but, you know, it's not a celebration, at least. I think so too, when you look through this, like, I mean, the systemic part of systemic racism, where after this period, so much of that stuff was set up though too, where there was some research done. The Great Plains Black History Museum had this, but during the night of the riot, the National Guard came in and kind of set up a border around North Omaha, which was nominally to protect the Black community from, you know, this 15,000 person mob. But I think a lot of accounts were that, you know, their guns were pointed inward at the people they were supposed to be protecting. But also that same border was used when banks were setting up redlining shortly after that, which decided, you know, who could get a loan to buy a house. And if you lived in this zip code, you know, you could, and you'd get a good rate. And if you lived in this zip code, you couldn't get a loan at all. So, you know, just that the riot in that kind of way just kind of cemented divisions and, you know, that kind of systemic side of it. I think, you know, maybe those ideas existed certainly before the riot, but it accelerated that kind of segregation of our city. Marlene asks, can you speak more to any descendants of the major persons involved in the hanging? I don't really remember names too much. When I was working on the book, I was blogging about this on my website quite a bit. And I think he would have been Tom Dennison's grandson, I believe. So he was actually sending me some family photos that were in his possession. Had talked a little bit about his recollection of, I don't think he ever knew Tom Dennison personally, but, you know, of course, there's a lot of family lore about it. Our communication kind of ended abruptly and didn't really go too far, but I don't know, that was kind of interesting. There was a woman who hosts a radio show in Sioux City, and she's also a descendant of Tom Dennison, although the part of the family that stayed up in Sioux City. So I think like they didn't really identify with Tom Dennison, or just more, you know, like, oh, look at the messed up stuff this guy did. But, you know, he wasn't the one who stayed, of course. His older brother ended up getting the farm. Tom Dennison had to leave and make his own way. The most interesting, I think, of the descendants, I'm blanking on the name, but if there was a boy during the riots who was riding a big white Arabian horse through the riot and around it, holding up a noose. And he was in the newspapers, like it was a big image, you know, of this kid doing this. So one of his descendants actually came and talked to me, which I thought was the most revealing, because she had just kind of mentioned, you know, how ashamed they were of him and their family, which was kind of something I always wondered about, you know, if people would share this history, if it was part of their family lore, if they'd talk about it within their family. And at least in this case, apparently they did. So she had mentioned that, you know, like everyone knew who this kid was and everything he'd done, this big symbol of belligerence and hatred, and tried, you know, to live that down basically, or to, you know, to reconcile with that. So I thought that was, you know, a really good sign, and it was kind of heartening to know that people, you know, would address that when it would be really hard to, you know, if it's your family, you know, if it was like your great grandpa or something like that, you know, you can kind of accept bad stuff they do, but, you know, like, what can you do to make that better? What was the other one? Oh, Judge Lori Smith Camp, who's a federal judge and really an incredible woman in her own right. She had showed me a few stuff because it was her great grandpa or grandpa, I believe, who during this period was kind of tangled with Denison. But her family had a history of like county attorney and then a federal judge of trying to take Denison down. So it was interesting to hear kind of her side of that too. To be, in a family where so much of their family lore, so much of who they're about, was fighting against this, actively in the time.
Hey, Ted.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just not very good at typing. You mentioned that you didn't feel when you started writing that you were kind of like the right person to do this. Like, what kind of changed your mind? Like, no, I really have to tell this story. Like, what made you feel like you were going to do this anyway?
I think some of it, like in the beginning, was just almost being stubborn, where, I'd kind of started on it and I wanted to do something really important, I guess. I was like 25 years old. I was like somewhat newly married, had a 1-year-old daughter when I started this book. So it just was kind of a weird thing. But sometimes, like if something is even weirder, it makes it even righter, because it's just like, well, if I'm going to do this, it must be for some reason. So I think that was actually a lot of it, which isn't like, it's not a logical response at all, but that's kind of what it was. Along with that, just talking to people about this history and people not knowing about it and feeling like that was important. Probably the biggest moment, like I had done a summer-long fellowship in Stuttgart, Germany. And this was the same summer when Michael Brown, or like the video of that, was streamed on Facebook of him being shot in the street. So I was actually in Germany, like working on this book at the moment that happened, and watched that live streamed on Facebook and just seeing this young man lying bleeding in the street. And it just I think that was the main moment. I already had a draft of the book or 2 drafts of the book. So, I'd already written it. But that just made me feel like that it was important, that this wasn't like just history at that point, that this was an important thing to do, and that I needed to make the book better than it was at that point, frankly, that, it's something that deserved a lot of attention and sweat and anguish to put into it.
Unless anyone has any other questions, did you want to take this time to tell us about the book that you wrote most recently, or the things that you're working on right now?
Sure, I can do that. I don't know if everyone noticed, or I put in the sidebar here in the chat. If you are interested in getting a signed copy of Kings of Broken Things or my newer book, In Our Other Lives, you can click there. That's a pop-up bookstore that my wife Nicole and I run together. So, I'll sign it to you if you want it personalized in any way. Just put that in the comments, and we'll probably deliver it to your house then too, since we're here in Omaha. I'll just put there. So my newer book that came out in March is called In Our Other Lives. So this is not historical, although it kind of feels historical in some ways, but it's set in 2005 and 2008. And it follows a family after the son in the family is a missionary in Pakistan, but he he's disappeared for a week, or for a year, and then is discovered in a terrorist ransom video. So the novel kind of jumps off at that point and is told from the perspective of an NSA FBI investigation into this family. So it's kind of a domestic spy novel is how I like to think about it. But most of it does take place in Omaha, and I mentioned that I'd moved to Omaha in 2005, so it kind of starts there. But a lot of period details from that era of Midtown Omaha and what it was like to live in Omaha at that time, just kind of overlaid with this FBI drama. The new book I'm working on, which is really early in the process. So this is historical again. A few years ago, I learned about Jane Anderson, who was a pioneering woman journalist. She was from Georgia. She was actually the first woman to fly in an airplane over London. She reported from the trenches in World War I, was reported from the Spanish War, and was tortured and barely survived. So in some ways, somebody who seemed like would be a really important figure we'd know about, except she was a fascist, and she broadcast for the Nazis during the war. So again, there's a lot of reasons that people want to forget this woman. So I'm working on a new novel. It's kind of a chase book through Paris and Germany at the beginning of World War I, where there's, so the story is narrated by a young female journalist who somewhat idolizes Jane Anderson and then becomes to, you know, to revile her for her rejection of democratic and humanistic ideals. So hopefully it should be like a suspenseful kind of chase novel, but set within, you know, this, this world of foreign correspondents and spies in World War II.
Well, that sounds great. Awesome. Well, we're looking forward to that one. So for any of our members or anything who are interested in that book or any of his books, those links are there in that chat box. I'm sure you saw those pop up. If not, I have those links saved, and obviously this is all going to go on Facebook, so you can find those links there. You can ask me. I've saved them here. So if you're interested in those things, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to put that in the chat box, the Q&A. You can raise your hand if you don't want to type. Like, I hate typing. You can just do that and we can add you to the video. You can just say it out loud. If not, like I said, Ted, you are the host of this. So whenever you are ready to kind of end this thing down, whenever you close this, this is just going to close out.
All right.
But I do want to thank you so much for doing this for us. It was so nice to have you here. Your talk was fantastic. We appreciate you coming and talking to our membership about this book and about the other books that you have coming out and about kind of the history of that and kind of how it just kind of runs into today's history. So this has been a really good talk. We appreciate you coming out for us.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Emma, and everyone for listening too. I appreciate the, I don't know, kind of making the best of the situation here too. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, sir. Whenever you're ready to say, like, just, I think there's just a leave button.
Okay. Yep. All right. All right. Well, take care, everyone.
Thank you so much,
Sunday.
Ted. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.